My name is Scott Keating. I'm going to sit down. I'm blocking part of the screen. um, so I'm going to be talking about Houdini for VR, and in a lot of ways, it kind of doesn't even really make sense Houdini for VR because VR really is just a way of showing things, right? There's not really specific things you need to do for VR. You have a game engine or you're rendering it, and really what you need to do is think about what you're going to show people in VR. But VR itself as a piece of technology is essentially a special kind of camera. There's not really anything else uh, that needs to be done for it. And VR has these huge benefits, which is that it's three dimensional. That's what everybody likes about it, right? You put it on, and immediately everything you look at is kind of interesting because it's fully three dimensional, which is very uh, unusual so far, and people are getting used to it now, I guess. But there's some problems with that. So uh, the VR has some issues in that they're not really issues for people who are enjoying the VR, but as you're creating content for VR, you have a whole suite of problems that didn't exist when your medium was two dimensions. And one of them is uh, basically a planning stage. So because the player or the viewer can sort of move and look at things from different angles very easily, and they have this full three-dimensional view, you really need to iterate in these early stages to make sure you're showing them the things that you want to show them, right? So it takes a lot of early stage like planning, getting things to work. So you're constantly iterating back and forth, like in the game engine, out of the game engine, to try and get these results so that people are comfortable and you're showing them the right thing. The other problem is that the depth that makes VR so awesome also makes things that we typically do in real-time applications not work so well, because a lot of things like normal maps, all the shaders we use, they don't really work in VR because they're tricks of the light. They're not actual depth, right? Like a normal map doesn't give actual depth to a piece of geometry. And you can see that in VR almost instantly when you look at it. So you need to use real geometry as much as possible. But then, of course, you pay this huge cost of having this very high res geometry. So you need to think about ways to take advantage of the high res geometry, but then use varying levels of detail, but preserving the interesting details that people like from VR. So basically, what I'm going to be talking about today is two things. One is this sort of problem of iterating quickly and getting assets ready. One, let's say you've got a high res asset. How do you poly reduce it in a way that works for VR? Because again, the depth is the part that's very important. And then some tools for iterating inside of Unreal using Houdini engine. Um, so, right. So for some reason, these codecs didn't play well with PowerPoint. So I'm going to just quickly pop over to these flipbooks. So as I was saying with the idea of blocking things out, what you would really love to be able to do is take a piece of geometry like this and just use it to plan out your scene. You know, like the simplest chunk of geometry that you can imagine. But this is actually enough to get the feeling of like, well, it's, you know, it's this wide, it's this tall. These are the angles that are being blocked by this object. Like something like this is about enough to actually prepare you for what you're planning, right? You use this in a blockout stage. It's a pretty typical kind of thing. The problem is, in a normal circumstance, you take blocks and then you replace them with really high resolution assets that are really interesting looking. And that happens separately. Like there's a game artist off making really cool looking stuff, and then there's somebody blocking out the levels. But in VR, those two things need to be much, much closer together because you're going to constantly change the shape of these things. And therefore, the artists need to be able to quickly adapt to those new shapes, right? And so ideally, you want to take something like this and block it out and just freely move it around, just edit it like you would do normally, and then turn it into something that looks much more finished. If I can open this guy, there we go. Whoa. Using this with the trackpad is not working out for me. Okay, I have a mouse. There we go. Yeah, and then so what you would like is to take that box that we created before and then output the basic shape of that box now with textures, you know, distortions, actual three-dimensional detail. and get something like this so that you don't have to constantly iterate with an artist who has to go sculpt this or paint this. You want to basically generate it from your block out. I mean, that's the ideal scenario. The reality is you're probably going to do this and then eventually give this to an artist and say, okay, now make that look awesome. But nevertheless, the principle is the same. So the first part I'm going to talk about here is how we did this, how we go from that block to this, using some fairly simple techniques. So let's jump back in here. Did that work? It restarted it, so you get to see this picture again. Okay, so this is the network that actually handles almost all of the interesting deformation and stuff that we saw in that picture. So this is genuinely that piece of geometry that I showed you, and here is the network that builds it. So can I just get a quick, how many people here are familiar with Houdini? Is people? Okay, so people know Houdini, good. So I don't have to explain nodes and all that stuff. We've got nodes, so this is the basic network. And so what we do is we take this piece of geometry and we turn it into a volume, okay? And I'll explain why we even bother to do this in a second, but that's what we do. We take our polygons, we turn it into a volume. In this case, they're VDBs. We do a little bit of work on it, like smoothing it. And then basically we apply this deformer, and this node here is the deformer. And you can see, it's a little blown out there on the screen, but you can see all the detail, all the cragginess that it's added. And so really it is that one node that does this interesting stuff, and it just does some pretty standard types of distortion. But I wanted to talk about this because this is something you really want to be able to do. You know, like a rock is like a super common element in a game. You'd like to be able to just pump them out, and you want to add really interesting three-dimensional information. But when you do that with polygons, and this is just an example, it's actually really difficult to add sort of extreme deformations to a polygon because it tends to do things like invert on itself. And while that technically is still okay, you end up having to do a lot of work to try and clean up those intersections or like cut them or do a Boolean against itself in order to clean them up. And that's just a pain point. It's a place where things are likely to fail in your system. It also means that if you have things like two objects, for instance, and you wanted to, if you wanted to do this kind of deformation and distortion, you also have to be very careful about how they intersect with each other. And then also things like the sharp edges on these cubes, this cube. A lot of times, you know, geometry like that has sharp edges, when you're distorting things by the normal, which is a typical way to do it, you can immediately get strange intersections on the edges because you have this perfect 90-degree sharp edge. So to take care of that, we can turn things into a volume. And if you're not familiar with volume, basically imagine like you've divided space up into three-dimensional cubes. It's basically a 3D pixel, it's a voxel. And so you can take geometry information and basically fill it with data, in this case using VDB. And you can see that when you do that, it immediately merges everything into one object, which is great right away. But it also gives you information about the outside and the inside. You can see there's no, that's just to show you there's no geometry in there anymore. We've left the world of geometry purely in volumetric land. And so because you're now dealing with almost like clay or something, you know, there's actual 3D objects that have volume inside of them. Even if you distorted it so that it inverted and went in on itself, it doesn't matter because volumes track the outer shell of what they're building. There we go. So you can see that I can add like a pretty extreme amount of noise to this, this model. And unlike the polygon one, if there's any sort of weird distortions here, you're not really seeing it anymore because it's basically always building the outer surface of the geometry as it goes. So even like going to something really, really extreme like this, you don't get stretching, you don't get the artifacts that you get from working with polygons. Instead, you have a nice total surface, which you can then convert into polygons. Because obviously, if you're going out to a game engine or something like that, you want actual polygons in the end. Most games don't really deal with volumes like that. Sorry, my thing is falling off. Right. So this sort of solves that first problem where you can throw very strong deformations on something and not worry too much. You still have some issues you want to be careful of, but you can take it pretty far. Um, and this is just an example, by the way, of what's inside that network, the one that does the deformation. This is literally it. It's just like noise and adding it to the outside of the volume, so it kind of pushes it along the normals. It's a pretty standard type of deformation. But again, doing it in the world of volumes takes care of a lot of issues that come up with geometry. So speaking of geometry, um, in the end, you kind of have something like this, which looks pretty good. I mean, it looks rocky, but of course, you have now generated potentially 1,000,000 polygons or something here, right? Like that's a ton of polygons, and that's no good for game engines. Even if you're just going to copy that thing a couple of times, it's a bad idea. Um, so you want to be able to do some kind of poly reduction on this, right? That's a pretty typical technique. But this is where the idea of being in VR becomes a little bit of an issue, because theoretically, this face that we're looking at here, if you were doing it for like a standard type of game, could almost be completely flat, and you would just have a really nice normal map on there and a really nice texture. And unless the player literally ran right up to that wall and kind of looked sideways at it, it would hold up really well. In VR, if you made that a texture map, it looks like somebody took a cardboard box and painted a rock on it. It does not look like a real thing anymore. So you have to be very careful about how you're going to poly reduce this to keep as much of that three-dimensional data as possible, while still trying to poly reduce it as much as you possibly can, because games in general are performance bound. You want as high a frame rate as possible, but VR is especially performance bound, because when the frame rate dips, people like throw up and stuff. So it's like the worst. It's not just like a little annoying. It's like they could literally fall over. So you would need to keep the frame rate as high as possible. So you want to be absolutely sure you're maximizing, you're optimizing as much as absolutely possible. So in this case, we just use a node that I think was added in Houdini 16.5. It's a new polyreduce node. And we can basically take it from this very high resolution thing. And it's gray here, by the way. You can't really see it in this image too well because we're in wireframe mode. So it's like, there's so many lines, it kind of turns it gray. And you can see I've done a polyreduce now to 3% of the polygons that were there previously. And you can see we've retained almost all of the actual three-dimensional detail, but we've dramatically reduced the number of polygons, which is extremely useful. And just before I move on, I also want to show that we're also using this awesome tool. If you've been here throughout the day, I believe somebody from SideFX presented on some of our game dev tool set, and this is one of them, this auto UV tool. So basically, you can see the UVs that were automatically generated from that rocky structure, and now packed together pretty tightly. This is another place where obviously if somebody sat down and did these UVs themselves by hand, they would probably get a much nicer layout, probably fewer islands. But if you can imagine being able to generate literally hundreds of these rocks, just by rendering overnight or something, the advantage of this sort of starts to outweigh the advantage of saving that small amount of texture space. But nevertheless, this is something we want to improve in the future, but this is where it's at right now. And it's pretty good and it's pretty stable. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at doing the poly reduction. Oh, this is just to show you the quality of the UVs, by the way, just how it comes out, which is, again, not too bad. So poly reduce. So the way that I just showed it was pretty standard. You have a very high resolution object, and you want to do a poly reduction on it, and it uses an algorithm to try and keep the shape as much as possible while reducing the poly count. And most of the times that's what you want, especially if you can sort of walk around the thing, right? Because you want more or less evenly distributed polygons over the surface. Is that playing? And polyreduce basically gives you that more or less by default. So this is me just dragging a slider lower to show you how it reduces over time. And you can see that you're at 50% and it's still holding its shape extremely well, but there's still quite a few polygons. But we can get all the way down to like 0.1% or something. And it's only really at the very end where it kind of like collapses in on itself as we get down to like 50 polygons or something like that. So polyreduce is really nice. It does a really good job. It also preserves your UVs. So when you're doing this, any attributes, anything you have on the surface is kept, which is really important because, again, you don't want to redo work that you've already done. But so here's, again, another problem where this generally would work, and in a typical sort of workflow where you can potentially see an object from all sides, that's great. You want it, that's exactly what you want. One of the benefits of VR is not always, but most of the time you have a really good idea of where your player is going to be. Because either they're not moving at all, because it tends to make people sick, or they're in a sort of limited amount of space that they can walk around. And that gives us a huge advantage when you're trying to do this, because you can say, now I know they can only be within this range of space, therefore I can actually do my poly reduction based on where I know the player is going to be. So here's just an example of this rubber toy that's inside of Houdini. And basically at the top view, that's a view through the camera, and then the other is just a top view. And what you can see is we're kind of looking at it from the side. And if you look at it at the bottom, the face of the toy that's facing the camera has lots of polygons, and the ones that are off behind it don't. They have these huge polygons along its back, for instance. And I'm just going to play this video. And you can see, so as we change the camera view around, from the camera's view, it looks pretty good, right? You're retaining lots of detail. It's nice and three-dimensional. But if you look at the bottom, everything that your player cannot see becomes drastically reduced. And this is really valuable because you're saving a huge number of polygons, but putting them where the viewer can see them. So you're really maximizing what the viewer is taking advantage of, that depth, which is really, really important. Where this doesn't work so well is if you take something close to a player and you do something like this, that's great because you're retaining really nice three-dimensional information. But if you took that same object and just moved it backwards in space, so just like away from them, just the way humans' eyes work, you stop perceiving depth very well as things move away from you. And what your brain starts to do is pick up details around it to figure out how big it is and so on. But what your brain picks out immediately instead of the depth is the shape of it, like the outside edge of the object. And so if you just kept this, you're actually using way too many polygons now. If you just move that away from the player, because the depth, you're no longer getting the advantage of it, but you're still paying the cost of having all of the polygons at the front. So polyreduce actually has this cool other option, which is silhouette preservation. And so again, you can give the UV, the polyreduce a camera. And by the way, it can be multiple. If you see the network here, there's just one camera, but it actually can just be a point cloud. So it could be an entire path through a level or something like that if you wanted to. In this example, it's just one point. Excuse me. Oh, I think this. Yeah. So again, here, if you look closely, oh, I think I may have accidentally pasted the same video in here. Give me 1 second to show you the actual other video. I don't think that's it. So I'll tell you what, if there's time left at the end, I'll just load up Houdini and show you show you what it does. But so I apologize for that. Let me get this running again. Oh. Yeah. So yes, so just to tell you, in case I don't get a chance to show you, essentially it does the same thing that the front-facing algorithm is doing, which is making things, keeping more polygons that are facing you, and instead it actually detects where you can see the edge of something and distributes all the polygons along the edges. And so instead of things facing you being very rich, you'll actually get very few polygons facing you, very few away from you, but a whole bunch around the silhouette. And so that gives you this really great ability to put an object really far away, really aggressively reduce the number of polygons, but keep the shape so that the player still feels like, oh, that's the same object I looked at when it was close to me. Which is, again, in VR, you're always fighting performance like crazy. So it's really helpful to have that. And then just because it's interesting, I guess, it's not really relevant in this particular case, but PolyReduce also has an interesting mode, which is quad, to trying to keep quad topology. So a lot of poly reduction will just make everything into triangles. But we added this mode to keep quad topology as much as possible. And it's surprisingly kind of amazing. Like, you can get quite low in polygons, and if you've built your model with nice quad topology, you can actually get it down really, really low and still retain the underlying shape. It's just really has nothing to do with this. I just think it's cool that it can do that. Okay, so then here's another tool from these game dev tools that I mentioned earlier. And this one calculates occlusion. So this is something that you could obviously do like in a render, right? You could bake occlusion or something like that. But this high-res model, this thing with the millions of polygons, we don't even want to have UVs on this thing if we don't need it. We want to just use it as a base to bake out something high-res later. So the nice thing is we can actually kind of skip that step in the rendering process and just bake the occlusion directly into this mesh because it has like a million polygons or something. So there's enough detail there to actually capture the interesting occlusion. And so the result of that top is just this. I've just visualized it so you can see it and kind of turned up the contrast a bit so it's more obvious. But you can see you get a really nice result, like very much like doing a render pass, except it's sitting there on your geometry. And a little later, I'll talk about how this can be used for other types of things as well, having nothing to do with lighting, but we'll just start here. So now we've got this high-res piece of geometry. It looks like a rock. Then we've also got this low-res thing with UVs, and so obviously now we want to do a baking step to take all that really high-resolution detail and bake it into the low-res. Most people who are sort of using Houdini for games, they quite frequently sort of skip over the rendering part because it's very much like a filmic kind of workflow. But there's a lot of advantages to working with a shader in 3D for generating texture maps. And so here's just a walkthrough of how we textured this thing using COPS, which is our compositing operators, to make procedural texture maps, and then our material operators, which is what you see here, to do the actual rendering bit. So this is just the final rendered rock here in the viewport on the left and the network that built it. Yeah. So the first step is that we just literally project a texture map on here. And this is like not even a particularly good texture map. It's just a bunch of streaky sort of noise and some patterns to make it kind of look like sediment or something like that in the rock. We have so much detail in the actual mesh, so we don't have to worry too much about the actual underlying texture map. This is basically like your albedo or your diffuse. And that just comes from this triplanar project node, which basically, if you're not familiar, just literally on each axis projects a texture map and then blends the edges together. And then from there, there we go. From there, we can calculate the curvature of that object. And that gives you some really nice detail. It's a really nice way of pulling out information from the edges of things and then applying it back as a texture map. And here's the occlusion now rendered. So again, pulling that data from SOPs into your render to get an occlusion, which basically looks the same as it did in SOPs. And then just combining all three of those maps or four of those maps together to give you something that actually starts to look, rocky and stony and so on. And then more or less the same process to take, to take some textures, project them onto the geometry to create sort of a specular map. Combine that with some of the other passes that we've already created, you can create a really nice, interesting surface. And then you're basically ready to go. So you've got this high resolution mesh with an interesting shader on it. You could even do displacements if you wanted to at render time to add sort of micro detail to the surface of the mesh. And you've got your low res mesh. So you've got both of them. Here's the interface for our baking tools, but it's pretty standard. You've got a low res mesh and a high res mesh, and you choose what you want to bake out. We've only baked out a couple of things here, but various game engines and various shaders will require different information. And so from there, and if I can just stop this again, that's play closed. Again, sorry about having to load this up. I'm not sure why PowerPoint really did not like these videos. Yeah, so this is, again, the final result after baking it. So this is a low res, this is just a viewport capture of the thing spinning around. And this gives you all the sort of options that you want. So you could take this now and do all those other poly reduction techniques that I mentioned. And because it keeps the UVs, this thing is going to continue to look basically like this with that quality of texture map, just with highly reduced geometry, which is really appealing. So let's say you've got a whole bunch of assets. Now you've built a bunch of cool props, and now you want to start populating an environment. And again, you want to get that fast feedback, that sort of feeling of iterating really quickly. So let's get this back up. This time I'm going to remember to pick. Nope. There we go. So here's like a whole separate set of assets. I'm going to turn a little bit so I can actually see what you're seeing. And again, the idea is we want to start from what's on the left and get to what's on the right without doing too much manual work. And again, a lot of this is about, this may not even be what you use in the end, but it's a way of getting close enough to your final thing that you can get real results, real feedback from it. Just to sort of drive it home, here's where we're going to start. This is the Unreal editor, by the way. And we're going to take all this stuff. This is all Unreal geometry. I should also point out there's nothing Houdini. These things were modeled in Houdini, but these are just normal things in Unreal. So the first thing that we probably are going to want to do here is do something interesting with finding information about what's been given to us by whoever placed these objects and doing something interesting with it. So in Houdini world, the simplest way to do something like that is something called an attribute transfer. So here's just a little very simple example network where we have this red sphere and a green grid, and the red sphere transfers its red onto the grid, right? Very simple sort of operation. You can see I move the sphere around and the green grid picks up the red color. And so this very, very simple idea, though, can actually open up a huge number of possibilities to you because it kind of gives you a way of knowing when one type of thing is near another type of thing. So let's take a look at something that's like a little bit closer to the example I showed you. So here we've got this sort of landscape with an object sitting on it. Wherever the object is, it transfers this red color to the surface. Then we have this blue plane, which is basically like the water level, let's say. And you can see as I move it up and down, it transfers this green color to the mesh. And this is literally using the exact same technique I just showed you with the sphere, except we've added some noise along the edges to make it look a little more interesting. And so what you would like to do is take this information and do something useful with it in the Unreal Engine. So something that's kind of neat about the Houdini Engine plugin is that it can take a network from Houdini and bring it into Unreal. And Unreal can actually do things with that information. So we've created these attributes, those red and green attributes that you saw. And then in Unreal, we're driving a texture map with those. So you can see near the water, we get this sort of muddy stuff. Near the props, we get this sort of dirt patch. And so this is now live inside of Unreal. So typically what you would do as an artist in Unreal is you would place props and then you would use a paintbrush basically to paint little areas um, to make it look more integrated, make things feel like they're fitting together. And the reality is, again, you're probably still going to do that even if you use this system because you're always going to want to have some artistic influence over it. But it gets you from basically nothing to something that works pretty well really, really quickly. And that means the feedback you're getting is based on something, approaching what you would actually want as opposed to sort of trying to guess what's going to happen. So just going back to sort of our start and end goal sort of idea here, that sort of takes care of this idea of integrating things a little bit more into the environment. But we want to start adding, vegetation and so on. And obviously, whatever it was 20 minutes ago, there was somebody giving a very good presentation about doing exactly this kind of thing. This is absolutely nowhere near the complexity of that. However, I mean, conceptually, it's a very similar idea, right? You want to get something quickly and be able to change it without worrying too much about that process, right? You want to keep that iteration loop as short as possible. So in this case, we're basically doing more or less the exact same thing we did with the transferring of red to green. Except this time we're using that attribute to create points. So we're saying put points here wherever this attribute exists. And here I'll just copy some spheres onto it so you can see how it all comes together. But this is basically the idea of saying, like, in a very simple way, if the ground is wet, then put this type of plant there. Maybe it's a weedy kind of thing, whatever it is. These are very simplistic rules. In this case, it's literally how close am I to the water? That's essentially the only question that we're asking. But again, it's kind of surprising when you use a rule that kind of makes some kind of logical sense like that, how quickly things start to look like real things. Even like this is about as simple as you could make this concept, but it still gives you a feeling of like, oh yeah, these reeds grow by the water and these sort of bigger plants maybe grow in the shadows of these objects because they like it more for whatever reason. And it gives you this, again, this nice fast sort of feedback where you can get something that looks reasonable to the eye and then plan out what you're going to do down the road. And again, for VR, this is crazy important because, again, a player is going to get distracted by something and you're going to be, oh, I just need to move that, an inch so that I can see the thing behind instead of the thing in front. And you don't want to have to go and move all these bushes in order to take care of that, right? So again, VR has this great benefit of the player feeling like they're immersed, but that means that whoever is designing the level needs to feel that same immersion as much as possible. They need to be able to go through that loop as much as possible. Okay, so let's take a look at this now, like actually sort of integrated into that little scene that we created. So here's, again, the same basic idea. We just bring in the digital asset that takes basically the terrain and the props as inputs. I'm being very generous by calling that mound a terrain, but it's a terrain. And again, you can see, very rapidly this very silly blank-looking scene starts to actually feel very integrated, especially when you start adding, texture maps and so on. And I should also point out here, by the way, that there's also this really awesome kind of not used that much feature of Houdini engine, which is that you can tell Unreal to apply a certain material to objects. And so in this case, when we load these things up, the grass textures and the textures on the terrain, those are Unreal textures. They're Unreal shaders. They're not Houdini shaders at all. But they're being told to get applied to different pieces of geometry by Houdini engine, which is really nice because you can still take advantage of the complicated shaders you can build in Unreal. Okay, so the next thing is we've got these sort of props, rocks and things, and we want to be able to put things in certain places on those props. So here's just an example of doing, again, a very similar idea to when we transferred the red to the ground, except in this case we're saying, well, instead of like basing it directly on some action like an object, instead let's just ask for some information about the geometry. In this case, we're just saying what faces are kind of facing upward, because that's where it kind of makes sense to put things like plants, right? Things plants rarely grow underneath things. They tend to grow on top of it. And so we can take that information, that's almost invisible on that screen, and scatter points across the surface, um, which again is the very simple concept of how this should work, and vaguely resembles real world ideas of how things might grow on something. And so from that, you can make a very simple tool that will take a piece of geometry and basically scatter instances on it. So in this case, we've got our cube, and we scatter these sort of little shrubs or whatever on the top. And as I rotate the cube around, it updates and makes sure that they only really show up on the top of the cube. So again, if you're a level designer and you're placing objects, you can immediately start getting use out of this. Like I said, even if this is nowhere near what you would use in the final product. And then, of course, just to drive the point home here, we're just going to apply it to, I think, all of the objects in this scene, just to put some sort of shrubs hanging down over everything, which is pretty nice. Now, these are very, very simple rules, right? Like, they're not, like, the top of something is not a complicated thing. But sometimes you actually probably do want something complicated, or more complicated, at least, than that. So here I've just zoomed in on this piece, and you can see in the final result we have these vines that sort of start at the ground and they grow upward toward the top. And again, this is meant to sort of mimic more or less a real world idea where there are these type of plants where they start at the ground and basically they try and get as high as possible in order to get sun and water, essentially, especially in sort of dense, jungly type environments. And so there are many ways you could approach this. But the approach we took in this example, trying to keep things as simple as possible, is basically to say, like, well, what's the shortest path from the ground to the top? And let's have these vines grow along the shortest path. So here's just an example of, just on a grid, you can see I've got a start and end point, and it just finds the path through the geometry to get to the other point. So you're just saying, start here and go there as quickly as you can, essentially. And it's literally using a node called find shortest path, which is its whole job. But the interesting thing about find shortest path is that it can do multiple things. So here we have the pig, and we're just starting on his nose. But we can actually say start at one path and go to a whole bunch of endpoints. So instead of one endpoint, a bunch. And as soon as you do that, you start to get a sort of interesting looking, almost organic looking action where things grow over the surface and they go away from each other and they come back together just based on small differences in the surface and going towards slightly different end goals. You can see it gives you kind of an interesting look. So, and it was fast enough that I thought this would be a nice solution to this problem, because we're also going to cover it with leaves and other things as well. So here now is that same concept in Unreal. We're just applying it to these three boxes. And the nice thing about the way we did this is we actually, under the hood, use volumes, just like I was mentioning earlier. And the reason for that is it gives you the ability to do things like this. Just put two boxes together, and now the vine can travel across the surface of both boxes, because in a volume, they're all just one piece, right? So you can quickly experiment with how things overlap and lay across each other and rocks that touch each other and get a really nice update. You get really interesting things. And again, this could just be used for asset generation. This doesn't even need to be done as a real-time thing. This could just be given off to somebody who's going to sculpt them to look really nice now. But it gives them this really fast starting point, which again feeds back into this idea of iterating really quickly and getting feedback, whichever part of the pipeline you're actually in, whether you're actually putting things in the game or you're designing things that are going to go into the VR experience. I also just think it looks cool, like when you move them around. It's kind of fun looking. Okay, so again, let's just throw this into our actual scene here, so you can see how it plays out on this geometry. And I think we just apply it to the uprights and maybe the sort of coffins, I guess. I don't know what those are. And it happens pretty quickly, so you can see you get a pretty nice result. There's not really much in the way of sort of penetrating the geometry or anything, so it's a very useful tool. I don't really talk about it here. I don't show it, but these all have UVs as well, right? So these plants are being UV'd, so they can be used directly as you're using them. You could put a texture map right on there, and it would work just fine. 5 minutes? Okay, cool. Okay, so looking at our sort of mock-up again, the next thing are the opposite of what we just did, basically. Things that are on the top of something and then grow down over, which is another type of plant. And here's somewhere where Houdini sort of shines, because there is no tool in Houdini to do this. There's no reason to have a tool in Houdini that follows a surface and then falls off the edge. It's not a generic tool. It's something you need to build specifically to solve this problem. Shortest path kind of gave us what we wanted. Attribute transfer kind of gave us what we wanted. This needs to be built, basically. There is no tool that does this. And so what we actually did is just created this simple tool where we have a starting point and a length, and basically gravity takes the point until it hits something on a surface, and then it just starts walking in a direction until it falls off the edge, and then it stops. And so you can just take this point and move it around, and it'll just travel along the surface and hang down. And this is very dumb. Like, it literally just walks in one direction. It doesn't do anything intelligent. But again, because it follows some kind of logical rule, it sort of looks right. It sort of feels like something that makes sense. And the way we accomplish this is by writing something called a wrangle. So in this case, this node called drape that you see just has this vex code in it that does most of the logic that you see here. And so the nice thing about using Houdini for these kind of prototyping tools is that you can really quickly build something to get a result using not that much code. This is definitely a more technical level than the other tools, but it's nice that you have that whole sort of depth to do it. And then once again, let's just inside the Unreal Engine just to show you how this looks in action. So in this case, we've also put leaves and things on there to make it look more interesting. And you can see the leaves do follow the direction. And one of the things that I really liked about this is because I did not a very good job at the logic of how these things fall off the edges, occasionally they wrap around. They kind of like go around it like that. But I ended up thinking it actually looked really cool when that happened, because you get neat things like this where the vine is like almost trying to cling to the surface and then it eventually falls off. And this is where, like, for me, like, proceduralism and these type of tools becomes really kind of beautiful, where just by accident, this algorithm you wrote did something that you would never have done on your own. And it just looks awesome. You just suddenly get these sort of moments of inspiration where you're like, wow, I accidentally did something right when I did that. And again, it just looks cool in action. So finally, here's just the final result sort of all put together with all of the pieces. And we'll just apply this to the most of the taller bits. And so I think there's 5 tools that we walk through there, and with just those 5 tools, you create something that goes from something really kind of boring and dead looking to something that feels really vibrant, right? And basically, most of this was done for the artist. And that's the thing I would like to be clear about this, though, is that this is an artist tool, right? A lot of times with proceduralism, people think like, well, you're taking away all this control from me. Like, I need to be able to, I want to put a thing like right in a specific place. And the way I kind of look at it is that, like, well, no, it frees you up to do that 1,000 times instead of 5 times or however many times you would have been able to do it yourself. And of course, there's nothing stopping you from going now and editing this further and very hand art directing, most of the terrain. So I guess I'll stop here, but here's the start and end point again, just in close up. I don't think I will have time to show you the silhouette in Houdini, but trust me, it's awesome. You can play around with it yourself. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope this was interesting to you, and thanks a lot.